I'm a PhD student at the Oxford Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, working with Dr. Ben Caldecott and Professor Cameron Hebben towards my doctorate. In my work, I focus on the transition of power generating companies to renewables and away from fossil fuel-based assets. So in the talk today, I will first take you briefly through some of the trends that exist in terms of how utility-type companies transition to renewables or not, and what they do to that fossil fuel assets, coal and gas power generating plants. And then I'll talk about the study that I've conducted to quantify different behavior patterns that those companies might adopt. And I'm using for that a large global asset level data. So in this slide here, you can see how companies have diversified, the top graph especially, into renewables over the past nearly 2 decades. You can see that in terms of both the units and the share of those companies, there has been significant growth. However, in 2018, for example, only 29% of companies actually have had renewables in their portfolio in one or another shape. And not all those companies actually have consistently grown renewables. So some of them might just have renewables, but not grow them over time, or actually reduce the stock. So 70% in 2018 are those companies that I'm especially interested in. I call them companies in dynamic transition or just companies in transition. Those are the ones that over those 18 years that I'm looking at have had positive average growth in renewables. But then when we look at the bottom graphs, well, the resolution is not great, but I hope you can see, is that both in the renewables in their portfolios, both in terms of the number of power plants and the share of their total capacity, varies and remains quite low still, especially when we talk about capacity, the right-hand side graph. Now you might ask yourself what they do to their fossil fuel assets when they actively grow renewables. Are they reducing the stock, or they grow it simultaneously? Here you can see 3 histograms. On the left side, it's an aggregate for the companies that have, over those 18 years, consistently grown renewables, what they do to their fossil fuel assets. And we can see that average across those companies, average growth is positive, meaning that they have actually grown fossil fuel-based assets. When we look at the graph on the right, we can see that majority of this growth comes actually from gas. Because for coal, the bottom graph, the average across companies is just slightly above 0 because of quite a bit of negative growth activity. So this already gives us some indication that companies that are actively growing renewables might actually still be growing gas, if not coal. And maybe they consider it transition fuel from coal. So to look at it in greater detail, I decided to use a global data set of power generating assets at asset level, aggregating it to company level, and try to quantify using clustering algorithm, quantify those behaviors to really capture the transition behavior of companies and understanding whether there are actually common patterns. And this is the time period I'm looking at. So here in those distribution plots, we can see 3 distinct behaviors. So this is how companies clustered. Those are macro behaviors, I call them. So the blue graph is the gas growing companies, green renewables, and coal. Brown. Interestingly is that both the histograms that I showed just now and also clustering exercise showed that there's little evidence for companies reducing fossil fuels. And this is true not only for the transition companies, as I spoke earlier, but I clustered on all companies, obviously. Then I wanted to look into this in detail, and I ran a series of hypothesis testing to understand what they actually do, those companies that are growing renewables, what they do to their fossil fuel assets relative to renewable portfolio. And what I found was quite interesting in that companies that are in transition, they grow fossil fuel assets faster than companies that are not in transition, which is quite counterintuitive because we would expect those companies at a minimum not be growing their fossil fuel assets, or at a minimum not be growing faster than companies that are purely dedicated to fossil fuels, power generation, or some other nuclear hydro that I'm not looking at. So then I looked what those companies in transition actually do to their renewables relative to fossil fuels. And again, I found the statistics significant results that they grow renewables faster than fossil fuels, meaning that those companies in general might be more dynamic, faster growing, companies with more aggressive growth strategy. So interestingly, the growth from fossil fuels might be coming actually from those companies that are so-called transitioning. And then I tested also whether they are actually larger and have a higher growth in size over those years, and that also proved true. So now you might be interested in actual composition of those clusters that I showed you, and this graph maybe shows you a bit more insight, but I'll talk you through. So the gas-growing cluster is the largest of all three, but is not much larger than renewables. And it attracts a combination of companies that are growing a bit of coal besides gas, or also growing renewables. And you can see a bit of variation along the axis. So as an example maybe of some companies that are in these clusters, we have, for instance, Duke Energy Florida, Duke Energy subsidiary that has grown gas from 7% in 2002 to 40% in 2018. And they have somewhat reduced their coal portfolio and started to invest in renewables over the past couple of years. And then I can give you also an example of a probably less known company. It's a Far Eastern generating company in Russia that has started transitioning from coal to gas by converting some of its power plants to gas. So it converted the whole 3 units of Vladivostok second power plant to gas. And they quote a main reason to reduce emissions, not only CO2, but others as well. So then renewables, it's slightly smaller and has a combination of companies at different stages of transition. So we both have, for instance, Eskom, that one might not expect maybe to be here, thanks to some of recent growth in renewables, but still renewables are only less than 1% in their portfolio, with coal dominating. And then we have, for instance, Oklahoma Gas and Electric Company, largest utility in Oklahoma State in US, that has grown wind from 0% at the start of my data set in 2001 to 6% in 2018. And they are still growing gas, but at slower rate. Gas is 50% of their portfolio. Coal is a third, but they haven't grown coal over those years. So that's interesting pattern of transition. And then, for instance, if we take an international utility, a subsidiary of that, a subsidiary of Engie, Engie Brasil Energia, they have regular growth in renewables, and wind is now 6%, and they haven't grown their gas or coal portfolio over those 18 years. So you might also be interested, actually, what might drive this behavior, and that's something that I'm looking at in my follow-up research, but I can give a bit of indication that there might be a link between this behavior and, for example, policy frameworks of certain countries. For example, gas growing cluster I didn't mention is dominated by US, Russia, and Germany. Renewable cluster is dominated by US, Germany, and China. And coal, interestingly, but probably not surprisingly, is dominated by China alone. 60%, it contributes 60% of companies. So when I looked at also the policy indicators that might be characterizing some of those clusters, I found that I found that, for example, for carbon pricing, the coal-growing cluster has the lowest share of companies in a jurisdiction that either at national or international level has enacted carbon pricing. And similarly to, for example, it has quite a low share compared to other clusters in terms of renewable energy promoting policies, such as feed-in tariff or the renewable portfolio standard. And it's valid also for renewable growing cluster, it's vice versa. They have a higher share of companies that are in jurisdictions that have enacted both carbon pricing policies and renewable energy promoting policies. But obviously this needs to be tested and modeled, and that's what I'm currently working on to prove the causal relationship of different factors that could affect this behavior. And what could be also interesting is that though, while it looks like clear cut, especially in the first graph, those three clusters, actually there are sub-behaviors within them. So growth in gas often goes hand in hand with some growth in renewables. For instance, 70% of that cluster has also grown renewables somewhat, and 7% of renewable growing cluster has also had significant growth in gas. So that's interesting relationship. And obviously, gas-growing companies also sometimes still continue growing their coal portfolio at lower rates. So I've also clustered companies more granularly, but I chose to show those macro behaviors because it's easier to show visually. Finally, this is the last piece I want to share with you today of my findings. I questioned, we have results over those 18 years, on average, how companies grew their assets, but did they actually change behavior within this time period? And here I split my data into three time periods, and the Sankey summarizes the results. So basically we can see that there is some transition, for example, from blue cluster to green, from gas to renewables, this green line, or from coal, for example. So it's around 15% of cluster has changed behavior in the first half, and here we can see a bit less from coal to renewables, around 10%, and the same from around 16% from gas to renewables. So there are companies changing, and one example probably, I have more, but I'll just share one, is the Dominion Generation, which is Dominion's power generating business. They, at the start of my data set, they've been growing coal and gas, but then they switched, around 2008, they started growing wind, and 2013, they introduced renewables and quite considerable capacity into their portfolio. So to finish, what I would like you to maybe remember from this presentation today, first, that there is this study that has attempted to quantify behaviors of companies worldwide using a methodology that is applicable to all companies, at the same time trying to map those behaviors quantitatively. And that there is actually a transition going on in terms of shift from coal to renewables, but it's slow, it's probably not sufficient in pace, and it's slowed down by the growth in gas. And finally, the work in progress that I'm currently busy with is to understand the causal relationship of some of the factors that could affect those behaviors, including the policy framework of a country. Thank you. I look forward to your thoughts.